You're listening to Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Two fans, two generations, all things Star Wars begins now.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Eric Vansel.
I'm Daryl Sanders.
And we're your hosts for what seems like the first time in a while, a non-Andor show. That's right. We're not actually talking about Andor tonight. Of course, first of all, I want to apologize for coming on late. You know, I know our schedule is just getting really crazy. Hopefully you guys enjoyed our pre-recorded episode on Friday where we did actually review Andor Episode 6. And of course, we'll be doing it all again this Friday, reviewing Andor Episode 7. But there's actually an interesting article that, of course, you sent to me today that I did happen to catch on Google. I don't remember if it was earlier today or yesterday, but it was basically an interview where Kevin Smith, who everybody knows from Clerks, and I think he actually wrote Scream, or at least is one of the main guys on it, because that was kind of a Wes Craven thing, but I remember he had something to do with it. And then, of course, I mean, the guy's just done a lot of stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
But everybody also knows that he's a complete Star Wars superfan. So naturally, everybody was just kind of like, well, when's he going to direct either a Marvel movie or a Star Wars film? Because obviously, he really has a strong allegiance to both of those franchises. But it was his answer that kind of surprised everybody. So you're the one that actually brought the story up, so go ahead.
So with Kevin, you know, he pretty much decided he didn't want to do a Star Wars movie or Marvel, honestly. He decided that, you know, that's something that he just didn't want to touch. And his main reason for that was because, you know, he's going to end up upsetting somebody in the sense of the fan base, right? So looking at Marvel movies, looking at Star Wars, you know, a lot of people hold these franchises near and dear to their heart. Most of us grew up on them, so this is why we're so attached to them, whether it was comic books, cartoons, things like that. And now trying to direct a feature as far as a theatrical release can be quite daunting because of such scrutiny that will come from the fans of these particular franchises, whether it's Star Wars or Marvel. And so that's where this story popped out to me. It was very interesting because this is a very key thing, because we always talk about, you know, different directors who would be good to direct a Star Wars movie. Is it better for someone to be a super fan, or for someone to be a casual fan, or maybe not even a fan at all of the franchise, right? They just have a particular flair for certain things, and they think, hey, you know, we could use this person in to tell a Star Wars story. So here we are on this Monday night talking about why is it so difficult, or why do you think it's so difficult for directors to want to jump on board and direct some of these franchise films?
Well, and that's, again, all good points. I think one of the main things that, as far as Kevin Smith goes, so he's a guy he's another one of those style guys, right? He's like Quentin Tarantino. He's like, oh man, there's a bunch of them that naturally escape me right now, but he's one of those guys where everybody goes for his style of filmmaking. And for him to say that is not surprising. He did do, and here's something funny, he actually did a He-Man sequel. It wasn't a sequel to the Dolph Lundgren movie. It was basically like he sort of sequelized the old He-Man cartoon from the 80s. And there was a big backlash against him for that. And so, consequently, you could see why he would be a little bit hesitant to do it, because he got a lot of backlash from that He-Man movie. And you can only imagine what would happen to him if he tried to attempt a Star Wars or even a Marvel film. And I think that that's one of the things that a lot of times these guys, going to your broader point, which is probably where we're going to spend a lot of time tonight, is that question that you brought up. Do you actually get somebody who isn't a fan of the franchise? And that's basically where Tony Gilroy fits into the picture. the guy that's doing Andor, the guy that punched up Rogue One, because he didn't really see much of Star Wars. He didn't really know anything about it, actually, which is really kind of funny. And yet, he's created some of the most compelling things that we've seen, at least from the Disney era. And then you have other people like J.J. Abrams, of course, Ron Howard, people like that. A lot of the directors, or Dave Filoni, being the prime example, probably the best example, of somebody who also falls into that superfan category, but makes really outstanding Star Wars content too. So it really is interesting because, yeah, as a director, and a lot of it, I hate to say it, but it has to do with the fan base. But then there is a certain reverence for it too, right? Where it's kind of like, Star Wars, I don't know if I really want to mess this up. I don't want to take any chances. Right. And I think that that's where you run into a huge problem.
Yeah, definitely. It becomes a very daunting task because, like I said before, that people are so attached to these franchises, whether it's Marvel or Star Wars. And, of course, Marvel's been knocking it out of the park. Some people are starting to get a little iffy with some of the things that they've released, like She-Hulk and some of the other things that they're trying to do with this with Marvel now, going into the different phase of Marvel. And fans are crying out about it. And that's the thing. We also live in a day and age where fans can actually really truly speak to a populace, right? If you have a podcast like Star Wars Head to Head, or if you have let's just say, a Twitter account or, whatever, where you can just pop on some of these directors, page and just start blasting them right there on their page. People have come under attack, as we've seen in Star Wars, whether it's Ahmed Best, whether it's Kelly Marie Tran, John Boyega, every Moses, what's her name?
Ingram.
Moses Ingram, right? So, these are people who've already come under such scrutiny just being in the Star Wars films, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, directors such as Ryan Johnson, right? So he's kind of the main guy that everybody's been kind of targeting for polarizing the whole Star Wars fan base anyway.
He started it, to be honest.
that snowball got rolling under him. And
well, here's what's funny about that, though. He's the guy that Kathleen Kennedy actually liked and essentially left alone, and they were touting him as basically the savior of the franchise almost, right? Everybody held him in such high regard, and he's the guy who made the film that pretty much divided the fan base.
Yeah. And I think, and that's the thing. And from what we could read, Colin Trevorrow,
I was gonna say, Colin Farrell. I'd almost like to see that.
Colin Trevorrow, he had a great screenplay for it. We don't know if it would actually transcend it well on film, but at least the story was very compelling and very awesome. So, in this conversation today, we really have to kind of look at a couple of things. One, directors and their responsibility when it comes to Star Wars. And then on the other side of things, we have to look at should they stay away from Star Wars completely, or is it the Skywalker saga that people need to stay away from?
Yeah, well, I totally agree that the Skywalker saga should probably be done at this point. You do have a situation where, like you said, a lot of it falls on which era you go into, right? Do you maybe start doing stuff with the High Republic? Because while you do have a certain amount of fan expectation where it comes to that, because we've gotten more and more source material for that, you could pretty much, because no films or animated shows or anything like that, or live action television, nothing has been made in that era yet. So you can define that maybe for film or live action television or whatever the case may be. Because right now, it's still pretty much in the category of literary, right? You have comic books, you have novels. But then going to your greater question too, you also have to look at it from the standpoint of, how do you balance staying true to George Lucas's vision of what Star Wars should be, but yet take it to something that maybe, and I don't necessarily want to say speaks to other generations, because this is something you and I have talked about a lot too, where the timelessness of it is part of what makes it so special.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that it speaks to generations of all time, that people come in, they discover it, it's not tainted by, any one generational message or something like that. It's pretty pure
Mm-hmm.
that way, pretty timeless. But at the same time, you don't want to be shackled by what Lucas did, in the sense of, if Lucas were still making these films, he probably would have taken it into different realms, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to keep it pretty much in line with what Lucas wanted and what he created, and the magic that is actually Star Wars. In other words, what makes Star Wars, right? But at the same time, you do want to take it somewhere in different, somewhat challenging directions, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, totally. And that's the thing, you don't want to be too much like George where you're trying to like basically imitate or mimic him,
Mm-hmm.
but you do want to follow the blueprint that he set out,
Yep.
and that's the thing. And let's take it for a moment. Like, okay, well, let's just ask ourselves, and we've said this on numerous podcasts, but what makes Star Wars, right? What does a Star Wars movie need in order to be successful? And the base, the root, however you want to call it, whatever you want to call it, is the story. If the story is not compelling, then you've lost already. So that's number one. Number two, it has to, and in that story, to kind of go with it, it has to be timeless. Like you said, it has to be something that's broad enough that anybody from age 8 to 80 can understand. It has to be something that is familiar in a way, as far as a hero's journey, things like that. Um, and then from that point, you need to start creating characters that people can more or less relate to and get on board with. So, there's a kid out there like Eric who really truly bonded with Han Solo. There's other kids who truly bonded with Luke Skywalker. They felt that hero's journey. There's other young girls who, really attached to Princess Leia because of how strong she was and how much of a leader and captivating she was. And then you like people, who like the humorous side of things. They like C-3PO, or, they like the coldness of Vader, and just how powerful he was, and just having that gravitas or what have you. So he created these characters um that people can kind of uh attach themselves to, and they become
Mm-hmm.
very memorable and iconic. And so when you're creating these characters along with this timeless story, now you're halfway there. And then the other part of it is, now you have to be innovative, in the sense of, okay, let's be innovative, but not at the sake of just doing something different. But it truly, once again, everything has to go back to serving the purpose of the story. So are we gonna put, we don't need to see like, oh, lightsaber nunchucks or something like that. Like, it's stupid. You don't need to do that, just to be
Yeah.
different. You see what I'm saying? Like, yeah, it'll be a cool thing to see, it'll be fun, but it's not necessary. Right? That's just doing something just for the sake of doing because you can. And one of the things that I learned very early in my production career, thanks to you, Eric, when I first started learning editing. And on an editing console, for those of you on a switcher, you have all these different things that you can create, these different wipes and circle effects, and stars go across the screen, and to transition from stuff. And of course, when you're young, you want to just use this stuff because it looks cool, or you thought it was. But you have to look at it, and you broke this down very plainly. So watch TV. What do you see? Cuts and dissolves. That's it. You don't see all this crazy, transitions. You have a basic thing because it's simple enough to tell the story. And I think that's where we need to get back to, is getting back to telling good stories, using the blueprint that George laid out, and then finding compelling characters, and then a director who can actually direct these characters. You need someone who's good with actors, who can really have an imagination, um, and do it. I don't think always that the director, it needs to be the writer as well. That's another problem I've seen, with a lot of these different films where, and I get it because the director's trying to have full control over the situation, but sometimes that's to the detriment because now they're trying to direct and write a story, and they may have to go back and punch up some stuff and then come back and try to direct. It's a lot on their plate, when if they can just focus on directing, a lot of times you might get um a better product.
Oh yeah, I mean absolutely. I first of all, and there's a lot really that you can deal with and just in all of that. But going back to the innovation for a second, one of the things that was cool was that Lucas had this. I mean, he was kind of a technological inventor type of a person himself. And he really liked to push filmmaking forward. It isn't just, hey, I'm trying to make this really cool, quirky sci-fi fantasy film. He was trying to revolutionize filmmaking, and he did. He created THX sound. He basically was the pioneer of the first digital camera. He was the guy that really revolutionized the way that sci-fi in particular was shot, where you're putting the cameras and you're having, it's not just the model is just going by the static camera or stuff. You're moving the camera at the same time as you're moving these models. And that's why we got, the whole trench run scene and everything like that. So he was a big innovator. And of course, that's something that you're basically missing from the modern Star Wars filmmakers. Now, that's not to take away from anybody. I mean, certainly these guys are really talented in their own right. But the problem is they can't actually duplicate everything that Lucas has done. And it goes back to what you're saying, where if you really want to make a successful Star Wars film, it begins with the story. And then it's not just the story itself, because some of these things, if you just read it on paper, so in other words, if you just said, hey, here's my idea for a story, and they wrote like a treatment or something, basically like a paragraph or even a page or something that pretty much outlines the entire story, you might say, hey, this is actually a really cool thing. But then when they make the film, it falls apart somewhere. And you and I have seen this countless times, where the story's good. And actually, in Lucas's own prequel trilogy, the stories were fine.
Mhm.
So I think that it has to be emphasized that you start with a good story, but a good story does not necessarily mean that you're going to have a really good film.
True.
It means you have a good story pretty much in a bad film, right? So I think that the next thing that they have to look at, and again, when you're dealing with a franchise that's as old as this franchise is, and you're saying, okay, I want to continue this franchise for 20, 30, 40, 50 more years. Well, now you have to start making plans. You can't just look a couple of years down the road, or maybe one or two films down the road, or do it by trilogy, because you can paint yourself into a corner. And that's exactly what happened to the expanded universe novels. They all just started coming up because they had this whole open thing. Lucas basically was like, okay, you pretty much have to leave the prequel era alone because I'm going to deal with that in my own films. But y'all could do whatever you want after Return of the Jedi. Well, now it was kind of like they had this wide open palette that they could start telling all these stories. And they did. They came up with these, 2 or 3 book story arcs, and then they had single novels, and they were going all over the place. And finally, they had to create the story group because it's like, well, wait a second. We have all this stuff, and we need some consistency. We need continuity within these stories. Otherwise, it's just glorified fan fiction. And that's one of the things that I'd always said is that towards the end, especially once they came out with the Yuuzhan Vong thing, it was like, ooh, they've really backed themselves up now. And in a way, even though I, like a lot of the fans, were very disappointed when Disney said, hey, listen, you know what? The expanded universe is done. We're refreshing the canon, and we'll let you know when the first book comes out. But in a way, I was relieved. Although, well, and again, the books are actually phenomenal. And to me, that's what they need to do. They need to look at what they're doing with the novels, and maybe you and I talked about actually making movies out of the novels. But
Yeah,
another
adapting
thing that
them
they
into
could,
screenplays,
adapting them
right?
exactly. But another thing that they could do is maybe work around it, right? So a book comes out, and then they just make stuff that's around that. And the High Republic
Mhm.
is a perfect example. They could go back to the Old Republic. They do have a lot of options.
Mhm.
But again, it's like you said, they got to find the right guy to do it, or woman.
Yeah. I mean, and even and comparatively speaking, okay, let's take Marvel, right? Now, Marvel has done very well with a lot of their direction when it comes to movies. But once again, you had Jon Favreau, who is also part of the Star Wars franchise as well. Um, Kevin Feige, being like the studio head over there, he's done a tremendous job and bringing people into the Marvel universe, and so a lot of the reasons why people really vibe with Marvel was because they stay true to the characters. Like the characters that look like themselves. They found people who could portray these characters very well versus, I mean, with looks and personality. And they've really told some really good stories uh, out of that. And they once again they had the plan of like, okay, look, phase one, we're gonna do this, we're gonna release these movies, and they're gonna bookend it with an Avengers movie. Then we're gonna start the next phase, and so on and so on. All booking it within an Avengers movie until we get to Endgame, and then now we're gonna stop there and we're gonna start anew. And that's one of the big things is that I always use Marvel as a kind of a comparison, but Marvel has several different writers because a lot of their stories come based off comic books, whereas Star Wars comes from the mind of one person, that being George Lucas. So, that's one thing we can always credit George for as well. We talked about his innovation, but he's always been a tremendous storyteller. And I don't think that gets acknowledged enough because, like I said, two of the
Mm-mm.
biggest franchises, like with Star Wars and Indiana Jones alone, like
Mm-hmm.
just those two powerhouses right there, it's just they stand the test of time.
Yep.
And
We're gonna leave Howard the Duck alone.
yeah,
we're
yeah,
gonna
this,
we're
you
gonna let
know,
that one go. That one's gonna slide.
Jordan misses a shot every now and again, but that's the thing though. I think when it comes to direction of care, you need a characters or a director who really is a actor's director to really truly bring these characters to life. So even if we do have a great story or a screen adaptation or whatever, we need people, or we need people who can actually direct these phenomenal actors and actresses to be their best. One of the things I was honestly disappointed in, although I did love the Obi-Wan um, series, I was expecting more out of Moses Ingram's character just because she's such a phenomenal actress.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like she's won, awards and even an Oscar for, some of her other work. And so you're like, okay, and granted, don't get me wrong, Star Wars is simplistic. It's not supposed to be some riveting, it wasn't designed to be that way,
No.
But at the same time, some of the things that way they portrayed her character, I feel like they underutilized her range and things that she could bring to that particular character.
No,
What do
and
you think?
I agree with that. I mean, first of all, I think that one of the things that happens is you don't want to overwrite a story or overwrite a character, but you also don't want to underwrite them. You don't want to underutilize them. And I think sometimes what happens is we get so caught up in the set pieces and the designs and the ships and the lore and all this other stuff that one of the things that Lucas was really good at least early on, was he was really good at crafting good characters. It was something that you brought up earlier in this whole thing where you started talking about how everybody can identify with somebody. There was a lot of people that could identify with Luke because he was confused and he was trying to find his way, and it was a classic hero's journey story. And then there were other people that could relate to Han Solo. And then, of course, the iconic villains that were created. I mean, there was basically something that spoke to everybody. And I think part of it was, and this is where I think that Disney has fallen short, is that they try too hard. You know,
Yeah.
you and I have talked about this so much, is that Lucas did not care. He didn't care if
Yeah.
anybody liked the. He was making his own movie. It was
Mhm.
basically like, pretty much if you just amplified the guy with the camcorder that's just kind of shooting their own little thing, that's pretty much what he was
Mhm.
doing. And to that,
Mhm.
David basically writes, he says, is Lucas so transcendent in creating Star Wars that it's the equivalent of saying Michael Jackson was so great there'll never be another? Um,
I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think there could be another, um, because we've all said like, "Oh, there'll never be another this," and it may not happen, in our lifetime. Just depending on how long we live. But people felt like there'll never be another Michael Jordan, and then along came this guy named Kobe Bean Bryant, who's practically almost like, I mean, his game is pretty much identical to Michael's. Um, People say that um, there'll never be another Michael Jackson, but I mean, granted, he was in a different genre, but Chris Brown is pretty much, is just as talented, as far as dancing. I mean, there's some other things that he lacks, sure, but it's a different time era. It's a different era, and I think that sometimes, you know, I'm telling my age here, but it's kind of one of those things where I understand now when the older generation, my grandparents and that era, the way they had to, the way they grew up forced them to have to be creative and innovative
right.
to get the things that they wanted, because it wasn't just there. But like now we have so many things just at a click of a button. It just automatically does it for us. There's no skill being used a lot of times. And so, um,
Well, that's a good point. I mean, first of all, I just had to interject and say he acted like Prince never existed. I mean,
yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. I mean, yeah, and that's another
Michael
one,
Jackson, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm a
that's for
fan
your
of
music
both.
show.
I'm a fan of both, but man, Prince
Yeah,
just, I mean, but
yeah.
here's the point that I was going to make about that, though, that's piggybacking off of the point that you're making. And that is that when people say there'll never be another, a lot of times it's kind of like you said, you could point to people that are, but there's two things you got to look at. Now, you brought up one of them, and that is it's a little bit easier to do that, right? Because you have YouTube, you have all this instructional, so you have all this stuff that's basically telling you, hey, here's how to do it. Not to mention the innovators of the past that you can now learn from too, where they didn't necessarily have that. And I think that that's where Lucas comes in, is the fact that it's not that he just didn't have all the technology, but just everything about it. Like, there was never any kind of a sci-fi. If you yes, Star Wars is technically fantasy sci-fi, but if you want to actually just focus on the sci-fi part of it, if you look at all the sci-fi films before Star Wars, it was vastly different. And once Star Wars hit and it became such a monster juggernaut of a film that just broke every box office record and everything else, well, suddenly now all these studios want to make their own version of Star Wars. And you and I both know that all the copycats started coming up. That's when Star Trek got a lot more interest, because there was supposed to be another series for Star Trek in the early 70s, and it almost happened, but it didn't end up happening. But after Star Wars hit, it's like, hey, there's that other franchise that's kicking around. Let's do that. And it was harder. It was a lot harder for these guys to actually do what they did, and there was no template. Whereas once you had a guy like Lucas, well, now you have a template. You can follow that. Now you might be as talented. You might even be like your final product could even be more so. But when you look at the circumstances of what they did when they created or did whatever it was they did, it was the same thing with Michael Jordan. Well, you could say that there's a lot of these athletes now that, oh, well, this guy is almost like him. But that's because fitness and the science of sports and supplementation and all this stuff have come such a long way. When Michael Jordan did what he did, that didn't exist. And that's one of the things that everybody kind of forgets about, is that you can look at all these guys, but you're like, yeah, but when they were doing it, you didn't have a lot of the benefits of modern medicine, modern technology, just modern information. In an age where we can hold up one of these things and pretty much get anything we want, and this thing is like more powerful than half of these like refrigerator-sized computers in the 60s. It's like there's just a lot more advantage that people have now than when people were doing it back then. And, you brought up music. It's like, well, you can fix everybody's vocals. You could do all this. And we haven't even gotten into the deep fake stuff yet. And which, of course, we did a whole show on that. But, there's a lot of things that you could do now that you couldn't do then. And people have more of an advantage to set themselves up. Now, the argument could come in, is that necessarily better? Because on one hand, you could say, well, now you don't have to be some super talented genius or something to achieve great things. And so the argument is you can have more people achieving greatness because it's a little bit easier and there's, the path has been cut. But there's also the other argument.
Yeah, and I think that's why, when I first started talking about like what goes into the Star Wars film, and I started off with story and characters and things like that. It's based upon an imagination. Like, people just don't have imaginations anymore. That's why you see everybody trying to remake everything, because it's already been done for them. But where's the creativity to create something unique and brand new that, okay, I really want, and when you're thinking about every little piece of the story, if as it were. So, like I said, taking George Lucas, for example, all right, yeah, he did the miniatures with moving cameras along with the models, but he also brought in a guy by the name of John Williams, which we've done a show on him, highlighting him, but like just
I
a
forgot about that one.
composer who,
I totally
you
forgot
bring in
about that. I forgot
you
that we
bring,
actually did an entire show about him. Yeah, that's right. We
yeah,
also did one
and
about William Hootkins, which
yes, we did.
is still
It's
getting
still
getting
getting
some
views.
views. Probably because it's so weird that everybody's like, I got to see what this is all about.
Yeah, but like when you look at somebody like John Williams and the genius of his music, coupled with, okay, now you once again, you have to be innovative. You have to think of like, okay, I got to take what I'm seeing on the screen and interpret this into sound.
Right.
Just the fact that how they've had to use for Darth Vader's breathing, like a scuba tank, like just being really in it. Like if you really just looked at all the
Yeah,
things that go
well,
into Star Wars
not
that
only
made it
that,
happen.
so there's that. The other thing that blew my mind was that the sound of the lasers was actually when Ben Burt pretty much went to, those like cables that hold up towers and stuff like that kind of secure them.
Hmm.
He just took like something like a metal rod or something and just hit them. And that reverberation, that's what you hear. And that was the thing. The sound design and the music really
Hmm.
took Star Wars and catapulted it to the next level. And that's another thing. Being a genius is also knowing your own limitations and I want to find the best guy that could actually, elevate this
Hmm.
project, because Lucas could have been that guy that's just like, you know what? It's going to be all me. I'm going to do it myself. I'm the genius. I'm not going to let anybody else play in this sandbox. He didn't do that, though. He was like, hey, I want to work with the best team. And that's how ILM was created. The whole
Hmm.
Industrial Light and Magic thing. I mean, the funny thing about it is everybody forgets a lot of times exactly what Lucas has done for filmmaking in general. I mean, there's just so much innovation that he's done on just the filmmaking side of it, the technological side of it. And that's another one. Because he had to find these guys that had to pretty much create the impossible, because none of this technology existed. It wasn't like you could just fire up a computer and make all these effects and stuff like that. They not only had to make do with what was available to them, but they also had to figure out ways of creating this next generation stuff that they wanted to do, but with the filmmaking techniques that were available to them, and then how to modify those techniques in order to achieve this mind-blowing thing, which of course became the original trilogy. And in addition to that, he also founded Industrial Light and Magic by just, these guys were so amazing. It's like, hey, we can probably do this for other people now too. And that was basically what they ended up doing. And that's why I think it's just such a great, it's just such a fantastic thing when you really stop and think about everything that he's done. And to this day, people make these comments like, well, he doesn't really know how to direct actors and all this other
Hmm.
stuff. And they'll point out a lot of these things. And don't get me wrong. We are not Star Wars apologists here. I mean, when things have been messed up, whether it was Lucas that did it or Disney that did it, we're going to point it out. I mean, we're not
Hmm.
going to go on crazy rants and stuff like that just to get more viewers and ratings. We would much rather you do things like, I don't know, hit that like button and hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell if you haven't already done so. That would be fantastic. But we
I
wouldn't.
like the way you did that.
I know. I'm trying to find more. See, that's inventive. That's the
Yeah,
kind of
see,
thing
yep.
that Lucas would do if he had a YouTube channel. So, you just basically find things like that, and everybody will always pick on the stuff that he ends up doing that's bad. And look, like I just said, we'll point that stuff out too. But I think a lot of times what gets lost is all this other stuff where Lucas just hasn't affected his own franchise. Like everybody has benefited from what he has done and what he has founded. He's revolutionized everything.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's why a lot of directors have a hard time trying to play in the Star Wars sandbox, so to speak, because it has to be from your heart. Like you said earlier, George Lucas didn't care because, and the reason why he didn't care because it was for him. It was a passion project that he wanted to do, and it's no different than a musician, right? You might make an album, and you're not making it to sell records. You're doing it because this is what's in my heart. This is in my soul. This is what I really want to do. I'm passionate about it. And if someone so happens to hear it and be like, man, like this is like the best thing I've ever heard, everybody should hear this. And that's how Star Wars basically happened. And there's a lot that we can go on and say about, George Lucas and what he's done for film, and especially Star Wars, of course. But I can understand why some directors are very hesitant about playing in that, because they know, they
Well, that
understand, like
yeah,
people
yeah.
who are directors, at some point you probably, that's what I'm saying. Even with Tony Gilroy, like, I just find it hard pressed and hard to believe that you didn't. I mean, even if you never watched Star Wars, I get it, but you have to be aware of it because it's such pop culture. You can't not know about it.
No,
At
and I mean
least
that's
heard of
exactly
it. You know
it's
what I mean?
around the world. I mean, people that are in indigenous tribes in some remote area of somewhere
The
like that
Himalayas somewhere.
have all heard of it. I mean, that's the thing. The impact was far and wide, even in pop culture. Now there are some things that, like China, it was the sequel trilogy didn't do that well in China because it turned out they never allowed the original trilogy to be shown there. So,
Hmm.
a lot of times people were trying to point that as a failure, right? Like, oh, look at how bad it did, or whatever. And it's like, well, can you imagine never seeing episodes 1 through 6 and seeing episodes 7 through? I mean, I guess you could get something out of it, but it's not going to have the same impact.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
So let's see. This is interesting. David says, if you don't know the idiosyncrasies of the infrastructure of Star Wars, can you direct it? Perhaps there are foundational building blocks to Star Wars that demand a VIP pass behind the veil. Well, and again, this is where I would cite the example of Tony Gilroy.
Hmm.
He never really saw it. He never really. This is where it comes into your point, I think, is that one of the things that you've said over and over today is like, look, as long as you have a good story, you get a talented director, preferably somebody separate writing it,
Hmm.
but it could be done by the same guy. It really depends. I mean, Lucas wrote and directed
Right.
the episode 4,
Sure.
so you could do that. But I think that as long as you understand, like I can understand people that maybe come into it and they've never seen it or whatever, but I do think that you do need to understand some of the things about Star Wars, like Filoni does. He's a really good example of this. But even
Hmm.
beyond that, I would also say that one of the reasons why Lucas succeeded was because he understood storytelling. He was influenced by Joseph Campbell and like the whole samurai thing, and then he took things like the classic storytelling tropes, the hero's journey, and things like that. I mean, he
Hmm.
was very studied in storytelling and what makes a timeless classic. He
Even the
just
Bible, he's used stuff from the Bible. I mean,
right.
that's what I'm saying,
He's
man. It's
drawn
just,
from everything, from all kinds of different sources, and and so that's what he did, and he applied it to this sci-fi fantasy story, and he kept the story not necessarily vague, because there's a lot of detail in Star Wars. In fact, that's one of the
hmm,
reasons why he started having all these books and all these, and I don't even mean the novels. I mean, like, here's the diagrams of a lightsaber or the Millennium Falcon and, all this other
hmm.
stuff, right? Because he created this really rich universe. But he essentially pretty much kept it very, um, high. He didn't get too detailed. It was very macro. And
Yeah,
it was themes more than specific story points.
yeah, definitely. I mean, can you do can you direct a Star Wars film without knowing all the idiosyncrasies? You can. The more you know, of course, the better you probably will be, in
Yeah.
theory.
Yeah.
But and that's why I loved, on Disney Plus, you hear Eric and I refer to this every so often, but there's this whole um review after season 1 of The Mandalorian, and the showrunner Dave Filoni breaks down kind of what Star Wars is
Oh yeah, that should be
as the
required.
macro.
Like anybody that comes into Star Wars, that's like, okay, you need to watch this 20-minute clip or whatever it was of Filoni
Right.
explaining this because
Yeah. And he's the guy who sat at, George Lucas's feet. He's his protege pretty much. But yes, you can if you understand um concepts, principles, um, and then what is it that you're trying to do. So if you're trying to tell a war film in Star Wars like Andor, right? Or Rogue One, okay, well, as long as you understand in every war, who suffers the most? The people, right? It's usually started by some government, and then they're upset with whatever, and then they're trying to regain control or take over. So who's affected by it the most? The people. And so you have to have people who are compelling characters that can give you the sense of power, dread, fear, whatever it is that you want to highlight in your particular film. And then in Star Wars, you have to like, okay, you have the landscape of, all right, well, here's basically what happened. The Republic turned into the Galactic Empire because you had a guy who basically duped everybody, being Palpatine, duped everybody, and he became the Emperor. And now he's trying to oppress pretty much everybody. He's like locust, he's devouring, wherever he goes. Okay, that's the backdrop. And then he started this whole war, and then you go from there, and as long as you have compelling stories with compelling characters, you'll do all right. Now, the more you know about Star Wars, yes, now you can, you know, um, punch it up in a bunch of different ways where now it's even deeper and even more engaging. But you can do it because look at J.J. Abrams. He's really a Star Wars fan, but he directed a pretty great Star Trek movie because and he really wasn't, a Star Trek fan. He didn't really pay that much attention to it.
oh,
But
that's a
once you
good
understand what it
example.
is,
Yeah, that's
once
a
you
really
understand what it is, I mean, it was a box office smash.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's a good point. I forgot about the Star Trek thing because that was something that I remember made me very nervous when I first heard he was making a Star Trek film and he'd never even really seen much Star Trek. In fact, I remember it was during that interview that he was like, I'm more of a Star Wars guy. And I started thinking, oh, okay, if this guy, if he could do this well with Star Trek, just imagine what he would do with Star Wars. And you could argue that there were some complaints, I guess, but The Force Awakens was pretty much a really good start to what could have been a new franchise. And it's like you said, as long as you understand the basics, right, about the general story and all that, then you can tell a good story because you're getting into it. Now, what I would say with that is if you don't know that much about Star Wars and you're coming into it, focus maybe more on telling a good genre story. And this is where Andor comes in perfectly because basically what's happening is it's pretty much a war movie type of a thing. It's just set in the Star Wars universe. So as long as you have a couple of TIE fighters flying around and maybe a blaster or two, you're gonna sell it. But you know what I mean? But
Yeah.
it's kind of like, but at the same time, if you really want to start making a film like more of the stuff that Filoni would do, where you want to start getting deep into the lore and explaining stuff, that's
Right.
when you
Right.
have to start knowing. Like if you're gonna bring in something that canonically is going to change everything after it, well, then maybe you need to pay a little bit more attention and you need to study up. Let me get this thing in the David was saying. He's like, I get your point now, Eric. I was attributing some of the shortcomings to a lack of understanding, like She-Hulk, and it seems you're saying it's just bad writing, storytelling, directing, etc. Well, see, sometimes it could also be when do you bring in certain elements? Like there are certain Star Wars stories that have been told, mostly like in the novels, that I don't know if people would be ready for, because it would it might be a little out there or something like that. And the reason why I bring that up is I haven't seen any of She-Hulk yet, but plenty of people have. Know some people who have. There are some things like when she breaks the fourth wall, when she does little things, and it becomes somewhat Ally McBeal-like, which is kind of what they did. A lot of times what people don't understand is, to a degree, now I'd actually have to watch the show to see truly how much this is, I guess, accurate. I'm trying to choose my words carefully here. The thing is, She-Hulk, from the way it sounds, is actually being true to the source material. The She-Hulk comic was very much like that. It wasn't like the Incredible Hulk, you know? So it's kind of like, I think what's happened, and this has happened in Star Wars, and you can definitely weigh on this too, because we can both think of examples of this, but this is a case where there's a danger in having a cinematic universe that sort of exists in parallel to its source universe. So in Marvel's case, the source universe is obviously the comic books. In Star Wars' case, it's really more Lucas's mind and story and whatever, and some of the expanded universe stuff that has existed for so long that everybody just takes it as canon, no matter what Disney says, right? And the problem is, you get people that are married to this whole source universe thing, and then when the cinematic universe comes out, they have their fans, because as you pointed out, you know, the comic books have been around for 40, 50, 60, whatever years. It's built up an audience. The cinematic universe is relatively young by comparison. I mean, the whole superhero, especially the Marvel thing, has only existed for about 15 years. So, but it has existed long enough to where now you have people that are married to that and that style and that perspective of the story. And so now you bring in something like She-Hulk. Again, there may be elements of it where it's kind of like, all right, you know, maybe they went a little too far here, or this is stupid or whatever. But there's certain elements, though, just picking on that whole breaking the fourth wall thing, that might drive the cinematic universe fans nuts, but is actually sticking close to what the comics were like. And the comic fans will like that because of that. So you have to be careful about that.
Sure. Yeah, and very valid points, Eric. I know, like, because you know, some of the things, and like for She-Hulk, for example, it just seems a little unbelievable that, like, okay, here you have, you know, Bruce Banner, this ridiculously brilliant scientist, right? He's been, you know, battling, you know, dealing with the Hulk and controlling it and trying to do all that. And it took him a while to control those abilities of changing into the Hulk and doing all that. But then, like, you know, you got like this chick, she's the Hulk for like 2 minutes, and all of a sudden, like, she knows how to perfectly control, you know, the Hulk inside of her. You know, it's just kind of like, all right, really? You know, it's little things like that. That would bother, you know, fans. But I think that, you know, when we look at Star Wars, you know, it's kind of hard because the source material that was used has been technically eliminated. You know, so outside of the books that were created, you know, basically Star Wars, A New Hope, Empire, Return of the Jedi, like, but once the expanded universe came, I mean, that none of those were written by Lucas. And then on top of that, they've been all pretty much become legends now.
Yeah, but here's
Now
the
they
thing you
can
got to look at, though. I mean, I know what you're saying, but now you have this whole new crop of new canon books that are canon. So the source stuff is there. And again, it hasn't been lived with for a while, but I don't know. The authors have always seemed to be able to do better with Star Wars than the filmmakers.
Yeah.
But at the same time, though, this kind of goes back to your She-Hulk thing a little bit. It was kind of comic book. Now, whether or not you think it's a little bit stupid or not, I think part of what it was, at least in the comics, was that Bruce had already been through this, and the gamma radiation thing kind of affects people. And if I remember correctly in the comics, I don't think it was gamma radiation. I think it was something else, and that's why her abilities were a little bit different and things like that. I don't know. It's been a long time since I read those comics, but I do remember elements of them. Because I actually was a She-Hulk comic collector for quite some time in the early 80s, or whenever it debuted. I remember, and it was mostly because like having a female Hulk was really kind of a wild concept, and that appealed to me. Plus, I'm a guy, you see this. I mean, let's face it. But
you had a little Captain Kirk in you, like the green
chicks. A little bit, yeah, a little bit. But that was kind of it. Now, of course, this actually comes in and brings in Dave's thing. He was basically quoting me and saying, well, when do you bring in the certain elements, right? Like at one point in fandom, do you bring in some of these elements? And he goes on to say, talking about us, you're really good. I never thought about that. You all need your own film. Yeah. Thank you. But as far as when you bring in certain elements, I mean, here's what I would say about it. I would say that you really have to do it when the fandom can handle it. It sounds kind of like a blanket statement, but from a marketing perspective, because remember, this is still a business. This isn't completely art. I think you have to do two things. Number one, you have to bring it in when the fans can maybe deal with it or handle it. And this isn't, I mean, when I say like bring in these certain elements or something like that, it's nothing controversial. It's nothing like that. It's really more just things that are so outside what we're used to. Like, for instance, there's a Star Wars book called I, Jedi. And it was one of the first Star Wars novels. It was an old expanded universe novel. And he was actually very much similar to the Mandalorian character, Din. But he was a Jedi. And it was a very different, it was very differently written than what you would expect from most Star Wars material. And because of that, I think that some fans, myself included, loved it. It's still to this day one of my favorite Star Wars novels. Even though it's Legends, I still recommend people go back and read it. It was that good. But the thing is, you have to prepare the fans to want to accept this stuff. And the way that you do that is sometimes you have to just maybe not stick too close to this linear storyline that you're trying to tell, and maybe start to introduce things. It's no different than if you're, because I always relate stuff back to music. If you're in a band, and a lot of times people are like, well, we want to branch out. The problem is, if you get famous because you are playing this particular style of music, it's a very narrow window. It's a very narrow style. Then you're like, okay, that's what you're famous for. And the more narrow it is, the less variety you have in the music, the harder it's going to be if you want to start doing something different. Now, we have talked about this several times. It could be anything from maybe you're known for, and no matter what genre it is, maybe you're known for playing a heavier type of style. So if you try to bring in a ballad, people might be like, whoa. Or maybe it's something to where you're completely guitar driven and then you start bringing in synthesizers and everybody's like, okay, what's going on? Or then you're a band like Queen, which right out the gate, they were known for being just like wild variety. Okay, if you prepare your audience for that, they'll be fine with it. because you're tempering their expectations. You're basically controlling that. And that's what they have to do in the film world. Now, granted, with something like Marvel, it's a little bit tougher because, I mean, I give it to those guys for creating the cinematic universe that they did, because I remember when all this stuff was out, or at least not out yet, when they were talking about it, when the information was out that they were going to do this whole Marvel cinematic universe thing, my thought was, how are they going to do that? They have so many storylines, so much source material, so many reboots of all the characters. Where do you begin? And so what they did was they started with a lot of the main characters and then told these individual stories and then brought them together at the end of a phase in an Avengers film. And that was the template that they followed. And when they did that, it's another good example, it prepared the audience. So everybody knew, oh, Avengers film must be the end of a phase. A new phase is beginning. That's what you have to do with Star Wars. And that goes back to an earlier point that I made about the fact that, you know, when you're just writing all these stories and you're only thinking 1 or 2 films ahead, or you're only thinking of a particular story arc in a book, you know what I mean? You have to think, you have to plan down the line so that way you could say, okay, you can prepare the audience. So then when you do want to bring in something that's a little outside, you're prepared for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with you. You know, you kind of have to start showing your fans uh where you want to go with certain things. You know, you start introducing, so going using your music reference. All right, you know, you might, if you, like you said, if somebody's used to playing a little bit heavy, but they kind of want to add, you know, some softer music or some ballads or something. Okay, well, maybe have a lighter, you know, song here and there on an album. And then maybe by your third album, you can start putting in ballads. But now they've already kind of been groomed to like, okay, he kind of throws in some little stuff now. I can see he's adding some things here. And now it's like, okay, now I can accept a ballad coming from this person because they've been slowly progressing to this point. And,
Exactly.
you know, it's, you kind of, you can't just shell shock, you know, your audiences like that, especially when they're so um aligned with a particular way that you presented yourself. It's no different. And I liken it to like a relationship, you know, like you meet a girl or you meet a guy and they present themselves one way, and then like, okay, you know, yeah, no one should stay the same. You should eventually progress into being a better version, and sometimes
No,
that
but
may
I know
be,
what you're saying, you know, because on that first date, right, you're trying to present the best version of you, and sometimes in doing that, you're presenting a false version of you. So that way,
well,
when the
that's
woman
true.
finds, in our case, right, when the woman finds
Yeah.
out, you know, what you really like, they're like, whoa, I wasn't ready for
Yeah,
that at
like,
all.
yeah, exactly. Like if I, you know, if I show up in a suit and tie on a first date and she thinks I'm some wholesome guy, and then like, you know, all right, I make her my girlfriend 4 weeks later, and then now I'm showing up her house dressed in goth wear, you know, she's gonna be freaked out.
Exactly.
Like, the heck is this? You know.
It's like, well,
So
I
you,
didn't think you'd be ready for that. It's like, okay, I'm
and
not, but
now,
maybe, right. Maybe, you know, if you had just, I don't know, suit and tie or whatever, but maybe painted your fingernails and had like a nose ring or
tattoo here.
something, you know, or something. Exactly. Like you're
Right.
paving the way, you're prepping that. And that's the thing that filmmakers need, especially in a franchise situation, because
Hmm.
there's like maybe 3 levels, right? Where well, there's actually 4 or 5. You have your standalone films, one and done. It's just, that's all it is. Maybe it's a statement, maybe it's just entertainment, whatever. Then you have other films that they do produce sequels, but they're not necessarily a franchise. You know, they're just maybe a continuation or something. And then, of course, you have actual franchises. And sometimes you'll have ones that are limited, and then you have ones like Star Wars, Marvel, all that stuff, where it's like, nope, we're in for the long haul. James Bond, another example.
Hmm.
You have these franchises that are just, I mean, they're designed to go on. And when you do that, you can't approach them like you're doing a limited thing, right? Because where Lucas, I think, was smart was he knew he had this 9-episode series. He knew that the fourth one was basically the most complete film. So if it failed or whatever, it wasn't like there was a cliffhanger. It was just
Mhm.
kind of a nice, neat story, right? So, okay, cool. But then he had this nice trilogy that if it had just stayed that trilogy, it would have been fine. Then he went back and made 1 through 3. Then, well, he didn't make 7 through 9, but 7 through 9 was made. Okay, fine. That was building this main saga. Now the saga's over. Now you have to decide, well, where are you going to go from here? And the problem is, if you want to use the Skywalker saga as an anchor in order to launch off other stories, like what they're doing with the television series right now,
Mhm.
that's one way to go. And you could do that. And you can basically branch out as you're doing that, right? So eventually you're going to get so far away from the Skywalker saga that it won't affect any of the stories. The other way they could go is they could just say, okay, it's 1,000 years after Return of the Jedi or something. Or they can go back
Mhm.
and say, well, it's a High Republic or it's the Old Republic. And now you're not
Mhm.
beholden to that stuff. You don't necessarily
Yeah.
have to worry about, okay, does it make sense for Ahsoka to appear? You know what I mean? It's like you don't have to
Yeah.
worry about that stuff. You're so far removed from that story that you don't have to worry about it.
Correct. Correct. Yeah. So I mean, I think, and to kind of sum it all up, though, directing a Star Wars film is quite daunting. You know by sheer fact of all the elements that goes into a Star Wars film. And like I said before, as a director, if you understand the macro, at least the macro part of Star Wars, and then you start maybe acquainting yourself with some of the micro, um, you probably will be able to come out with a good film. But I think it just takes an imaginative person and someone who really has a a a love for putting out something that, and you're not going to make everybody happy. There's always going to be somebody who's going to complain. I mean, it's just the way it is. But overall, I think if you really stick to those things, you will probably come out with a pretty good film.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I would say if you're a director that's, I mean, not that any director's necessarily watching this going, oh, I'm glad that those guys, they made me feel pretty good. Maybe I will take the job after all. But if you just basically start with the ingredients that make any film a good film, good story, good characters, good pacing, because pacing's another thing that a lot of times filmmakers, they'll have the first two, but then the pacing's all wrong, and that's then it becomes a disaster. But if you have these things, the rest could be worked out. All you have to do is just tell a good story and you're going to be fine. And then the audience will be fine. But just prepare them for what they're going to get. You want to under promise, over deliver. I mean, you and I both know that it's like a bunch of platitudes that we're basically saying. But I mean, this is basically the way that you just tell a good story. I think a lot of times what happens, and you've said this, I've said this on multiple shows, people get hung up on the fact that this is Star Wars and the fan expectation. And as
Hmm.
fans, I will say it. We have actually created our own monster. Now we've got famous directors that they don't even want to touch the franchise because of us. Maybe not me personally, but us as a collective, right? And I think that that is one of the things that's a complete disservice. And you've said it, I've said it on multiple shows. The problem is we have to start letting these people tell the good stories and everything without just fixating on this stuff. Oh, the lightsaber hilt was all wrong, or, it's, I mean,
Right.
when you really go back and look at what Lucas did, I mean, he just basically took like all these weird parts and stuff like that and fashioned it together. It's what they had.
Mm-hmm.
And again, don't get me wrong. I mean, one of the things I love about Star Wars is you can pay attention to those details because they're there. But I think in a lot of ways, fans have to accept a little bit of responsibility too in this whole thing. So
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, I mean, I think that even though I think we can agree that Star Wars, as it is right now, nobody can blame anybody for not wanting to touch this thing because it's like, look, you know what? And it's like Kevin Smith basically said, there's a bunch of people can make these movies. I'm the only one that can make Kevin Smith movies, so I'm going to keep making Kevin Smith movies. Quentin Tarantino can say the same thing.
Yep.
David Gordon Green makes specific movies. There's a handful of directors that actually, Jordan Peele, another one, where they basically, there's like a certain style that they have that's uniquely theirs. And it would be tempting for Kathleen Kennedy to go, I wonder what that would look like in a Star Wars setting. But I can also understand, look, I don't want to taint my whole career, basically, and have people hate me, like poor Rian Johnson, just because I happened to make a film and people thought I got the Stormtrooper helmet wrong or something. I mean, it's just, you don't really want to go through that. So even though it can be a nightmare, I do think it's good that you do have people, and we've been saying his name a lot tonight, Tony Gilroy, because here's a guy who hasn't really seen Star Wars, and because of that, he doesn't really care. He doesn't really care about the fandom. All he cares about is making something good, and he has. Mm-hmm. And you do that, and I think you're good. So, again, all that remains is, you know what we think, you know what David thinks, because he's been chatting with us live all night. But what do you guys think? Make sure you leave your comment in the comment section. What do you think of Kevin Smith's comments? We can leave it at that, actually, because there's a lot there. So this Friday, I think it's going to be live. Actually, not really sure, but it's going to be live or it's going to be pre-recorded because Andor's coming out.
Andor.
Episode 7 is coming out in a couple of days, and we're going to be reviewing it this Friday, 8 o'clock. We promise. We think. So make sure that you guys watch it. Of course, we're live every Monday and Friday at 8. If we're not, we try to put a pre-recorded episode in there for you guys. Make sure you hit that like button, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, because we are going to try to put out some additional content. And, of course, you're going to want to be reminded. Maybe we're going to go live and time gets away from you. It's happened to us. Like, oh, man, I've got to go on in a few minutes. So, see you guys Friday at 8. With that, I'm Eric Vansel.
I'm Daryl Sanders.
May the Force be with you.
Always.
Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @HeadToHeadSW. Submit your questions for our next show. Visit our official website at headtoheadswpodcast.com. Until next time, may the Force be with you, always.